Did you hear that?
It's 12 o'clock.
It's midnight. Look at the clock. One hand has met the other hand. They kiss. Isn't that wonderful?
That's the way a clock works. What's wonderful about it?
But Ninotchka, it's midnight. One half of Paris is making love to the other half.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1939, and Donald Brackett joins us to discuss Ninotchka and the writing collaboration between Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. We are here with Donald Brackett. Welcome, Donald.
Hello.
A week has passed since our previous Ninotchka episode, but for me, a year and a half has passed since our last Ninotchka episode. So if I sound older, more grizzled, that's why. So we're here not only to talk about Ninotchka, which we had the immense privilege of screening at VIFF a few weeks ago. We're here to talk about two of the creative forces behind the film. They aren't totally new to the show because they were co-writers for Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, but this is inarguably the more famous of their two collaborations between Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett, and Ernst Lubitsch, and that is Ninotchka. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Ninotchka. We're going to talk about how these two young gun writers got involved with the film, and we are going to talk about what happened to their career going forward in what is, I think, a very tempestuous, riven creative relationship. I think that's fair to say.
That's putting it mildly. And I always sound old and grizzled, so we're okay. We're balanced in that regard. But I'm very glad to be here because Lubitsch really brought these two together, launched their careers in Hollywood. And I'm not sure they would be who they are today if Ernst Lubitsch hadn't inaugurated them. And so I thought to myself, what's the best way to chronicle this twisted saga of this very creative and successful, but also very tortured and tumultuous partnership? And it was tumultuous and tortured. And my new book, Double Solitaire, tells a kind of behind-the-scenes story of a friendship made in hell, an accidental friendship. Despite their shared nickname, writer-producer Charles Brackett and writer-director Billy Wilder were not, in fact, the, quote, happiest couple in Hollywood, which is the sanguine Life magazine title of an article about them. It was total spin. It was 1944. Somebody went and looked at them in the office, had them stage exchanges, and literally were called the happiest couple in Hollywood. Actually, they disliked each other intensely, even as they collaborated on some of the most iconic films of Hollywood's golden age, including Ninotchka, and eventually Lost Weekend, Foreign Affair, Sunset Boulevard, absolute classics. They achieved an almost inexplicable alchemy. Doesn't matter if you don't like each other. If your genius is sparked by another genius and you end up making the Rubber Soul album, smart people don't deny that. Other people who have more of an ego clash want to be independent. You can understand why they want to be independent. I want to do this. I don't want to depend on you to make what I do. At any rate, I delved into the family lore because essentially this family relative of mine, my great-great-grandfather was Charles Brackett's cousin. I looked at correspondence, contemporary media reports, all other manner of historical records to reconstruct the strange magic and how their entrepreneurial drive, and this is what I learned most importantly for me, against the constraints of the studio system, being treated like racehorses basically, anticipated the independent producer models of today. And yes, Ninotchka, what a gem.
It was such a pleasure to watch this in the cinema for the first time for me. I've only ever seen this film, like most of these films, in the comfort of our home. And so being there and seeing it play as a crowd-pleasing comedy. There were belly laughs. I heard people, there was a couple hoots and hollers. It was great.
It was a wonderful experience. And people, I like to sit at the back because I like to observe the audience. And they all laughed in the right places. They cried in the right places. And I laughed and cried all the way through it. And yes, it's delightful on a large screen like that. It was an excellent print. Everything was as it should be.
It was just a lovely example of something I deeply believe, which is that cinemas are, I was about to say cinemas are for comedies, but that's too trollish. But cinemas are a perfect place to play a comedy. And I think we've kind of lost that. I try not to be like the old alarmist man of like, we used to build things in this country, whatever. But we used to show comedies in cinemas and we don't anymore.
I agree with you. And I think that cinema is perfect for both comedy and tragedy. And one of the most beautiful things I found in researching my book was that they were equally adept at comedy and tragedy. And I think one of the startling things for me, once I started researching the book, was, first of all, that they didn't get along, extremely didn't get along, but also the relationship between comedy and tragedy. And the fact that someone, I think it was Dorothy Parker, defined comedy as tragedy plus time. And that's why there's a mixture in Ninotchka, even, as a good example, of uproarious comedy And as there was in the earlier Lubitsch film, almost too uproarious in the first film they did together, a bit hysterical, Bluebird's Eighth Wife, but I still love it. I like it because there's a magic to it that can't be reached in any other way. And vintage films, I don't like to call them classic particularly because that seems like a certain kind of heavy-duty judgment, but vintage films are often classic. The best comedies and the best tragedies have a mixture of both elements, like human life. It's a mixture.
That reminds me of the famous Chaplin quote of life is tragedy in close-up, comedy in long shot.
Exactly.
So many of the funniest movies are all the funnier because they acknowledge the sadness. That's Ninotchka. That's so much of Lubitsch's films too.
Oh, Lubitsch for sure was a king of that. And he started so early. And I think one of the magic things about Lubitsch, as you well know and your listeners are well aware of, he had a touch that became known as the Lubitsch touch, but he was able to mix laughter and tears. The dark is what allows us to both weep openly and laugh, if we want, uproariously at something. The film festival screening was a great example of that. And I remarked at the talk we were having afterwards that younger people, and I don't like to demographic people, but sometimes have a challenge with vintage films. First of all, they're black and white. Sometimes they're not pristinely black and whites, and they take some visual adjustment. But what's required is what's required for any film, because all films are magical to me. And the first time I saw Ninotchka, I was 10 years old. I saw it on television like you recently did. And I was off from school. I had the flu, or I was pretending to have the flu, and I watched it on CBC. They used to have a recycling of old Hollywood films because they didn't have a ton of fresh programming. So I was treated to a lot of classic films. And I saw Ninotchka, and I was alone at home. And I was just so touched by it. And I realized, okay, well, you're not 10 years old anymore, but I found it really racy and incredibly sexy and incredibly charged with the predator aspect in a good way of the trying to romance Ninotchka that Melvyn Douglas did. And I didn't know why it was racy because I was 10 years old. Eventually, I started watching tons of classic films on CBC. And the one after that I watched, I think the following week, was Sunset Boulevard. I was treated to this weird spectrum of laughter and comedy and tragedy and tears, both by the same writer. And I was looking at the screen and I saw my family names there, Brackett, Charles Brackett, who is this? And it led me into a romance, not just with films, I guess. And it's not just because there was a family connection. I think I was preternaturally prone to like films. It's almost like in my DNA. But when I started so young, and of course I even started watching films younger than 10, but to me, there was an escape to it that everybody experiences today, of course. That's what films are about. All films are magic to me, and real magic. The lights go down, and if they're treating it properly and the writers and producer and director are doing their best work, you're not aware you're watching a film. And recently at the film festival screening that we were at, I felt like I was 10 years old again. And I was laughing and crying. And fortunately, all those people, maybe they're a particular film festival crowd, but they all registered exactly the same emotions. And that's a tribute to Lubitsch and to Brackett and Wilder. And the rest of it that's so amazing to me is the gist of my book, Double Solitaire, which is how they ended up working together in the first place. And when I say he launched their careers, he really did. I mean, he had come much earlier during the silent era, 1923 or 22, and he continued to make silent films, won an Oscar for a silent film while in Hollywood, became royalty in Hollywood. And Brackett and Wilder were both, in a sense, expatriates. They both came from elsewhere in terms of Hollywood. Wilder came from Berlin, the same place as Lubitsch, so he had a lot in common with Lubitsch. Brackett came from New York, which is another planet from Hollywood. And they both had drastically different backgrounds. But I think Brackett was the same age as Lubitsch, number one. And so he had a lot in common generationally. Wilder was a young punk. He was barely 30. And when I say he was a punk, he really was. He was like a really foul-mouthed, abrupt, somehow a little defensive character.
And the word pugnacious I've seen used quite a few times.
Pugnacious, yes. I think it was a defense mechanism in his case, because when he came, he barely spoke any English. He left Vienna, went to Berlin, went to Paris. He did newspaper work in Paris. And then he worked with Robert Siodmak, famously on People on Sunday, 1930. Made his first film incredibly young. He was like a Thalberg type in a sense of being a wunderkind. And he had to escape, of course, to Hollywood, like a lot of other Jewish expatriates from Berlin, sadly leaving a lot of his family behind. Brackett, on the other hand, was well seasoned as a writer. First of all, he spoke English, unlike Wilder. He spoke American English. He had 5 novels under his belt. He was the drama critic from The New Yorker. And he was drawn to Hollywood like a lot of other writers like Fitzgerald and Faulkner and tons of others, serious writers who were going to be tempted, seduced into writing for the films. And I think about 1925, one of his novels, they brought him to Hollywood. It was made. Then he went back to New York. And he didn't really fit in to Hollywood any more than Wilder did, but in drastically different ways. And a few years ago, when I was doing the research on the book, that was after curating a program for Cinematheque called Strange Magic, the films of Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder. And I called the book and the program Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder because everybody knows a lot about Billy Wilder. They don't, however, know much about Charles Brackett, the 13 films they made together, they wrote, produced, and eventually directed together. And there's a reason for that. Brackett died in 1969. There was 13 years difference. Wilder lived on until 2003, I think it was, maybe 2006.
He was in his 90s.
Something. He was old. There was a lot of time to repair, from his point of view, what he wanted the legend to be. He had also moved on to a second screenwriter at that point. He was lucky to have two incredible partners. I think the three of them had this dynamism together, Lubitsch, Brackett, and Wilder, which was, I think if they hadn't worked with Lubitsch, everything would have been different in their career. I'm not sure they would have gone on to make 3 films for Mitchell Leisen or made a film for Howard Hawks and then moved on to make their own screenwriter, produced, and director films. But I think Brackett related to Lubitsch because they were both the same age. One of the things I'm going to occasionally do is I learned while researching the book, not just about the films they made together, but their relationship. And then the bad relationship they had, the confrontational, argumentative, insanely just negative dynamics they had. And I was stunned by that because I started out writing a book about, okay, this relative, they made these films, they're famous, they're wonderful, they won Oscars. But eventually I realized I'm really writing about the dynamics of creative collaboration and what it means when you collaborate with somebody and make really amazing work, a person you can't stand, that you really don't like. And I mean, they don't like being in the same room together, not just while we occasionally disagree. They just loathe each other. And I thought that's incredibly strange. But then I realized I started researching dynamics of collaboration and partnerships, and it's not that uncommon. The best work is often made not just by filmmakers, but in the music world, by people who don't just compete. They really don't like depending on that partner. The result, if it's a Grammy Award or an Oscar, Academy Awards, whatever it doesn't help them. In fact, that makes it worse because they have to depend on that person. There's a mutual codependence, I guess it's called in psychology. Imagine, well, the same thing happened with Lennon and McCartney, Jagger and Richards, Daltrey and Townsend, tons of others, Neil Young and Stephen Still.
The entirety of Fleetwood Mac.
That's the best example of people who make actual work out of the animosity they have, the love affair they had, the breakup they had. They don't separate and go away. They just actually continue making work. And I'm still obsessed with this notion of people who don't like each other only being able to work together because Lennon and McCartney are much better together, Jagger and Richards better together. And so the same is true of Brackett and Wilder. And when they went into the crucible, as I call it, of the Lubitsch world, I mean, he had, I think, and you probably know more about this, a skill. I mean, I think he was everyone's uncle, the way I understand it. He was really a relatively easygoing. He had a phenomenal, balanced personality. One point I'm going to make is the importance of discovering Charles Brackett's private diaries for me, because that was like he was in the room with Lubitsch. He was in the room with Wilder. And that gained access to something privileged, I think, which is quite unique. And he, Charles Brackett, referred to Lubitsch. He said that some of America's greatest and most sophisticated films boast the famous Lubitsch touch. He regarded Lubitsch as his mentor, and so did Wilder.
And they both vied for his approval, too. I know that there was some tension over who was the favorite son.
They were very jealous of his attention. And Wilder had the advantage of speaking German. Brackett had the advantage of speaking American. And so Lubitsch took advantage of both of those abilities. And when Wilder got angry with Brackett, which was every other sentence, he would start talking in German to Lubitsch. When Lubitsch got fed up with the antics, I think he called them, of Wilder, he would start seeking American jargon or technicalities or literary skills from Brackett. What he did know, though, Lubitsch, was that they were both geniuses. One of them was a very sophisticated, urbane New York literary genius with 5 novels and tons of articles, and he hung out in Europe with the Lost Generation around Gertrude Stein and Fitzgerald and Hemingway. The other was a more primitive kind of genius. He didn't know how to do, Wilder, what he was doing. He didn't know what to call what he was doing. He had a really primitive skill. Although they were only associated with 2 films, Bluebird's Eighth Wife, 38, and Ninotchka, 39, Brackett socialized with Lubitsch all the time, and his family and his wife, much more than Wilder did. And in fact, Brackett promoted a special Academy Award for the director Lubitsch in 1947, and he wrote and read the eulogy at Lubitsch's funeral. Unlike Wilder, Brackett would hang out with the social elite of the entertainment and literary worlds. It's not so much the two did not socialize together, Brackett and Wilder. They did. They spent a lot of time together. In fact, Wilder has remarked that it was more than a marriage. It was more intimate than a marriage. It was certainly more intimate than Wilder's marriage. And it was more intimate than Brackett's marriage, too, since he was a closeted gay guy, a Republican gay guy in 1930s. So that's kind of odd. But they really moved in completely different social circles. And perhaps there's some validity to Wilder's claim that we had nothing in common except great writing, which is really the truth. But the pair spent too much time together discussing each other's lives, and in the case of Wilder, his love affairs, for it to be labeled a strictly professional partnership. It was very intimately based. But certainly Wilder did not belong among Brackett's friends, and Brackett's did not belong among Wilder's friends, though there were obvious exceptions, most notably Walter Reich and Ernst Lubitsch, who were equally close to both men. Now, in his diaries, Brackett refers to how he came into contact with Lubitsch. Lubitsch found out, first of all, Wilder had an earlier partner before Brackett, Frank Patros. And Frank Patros and Wilder didn't get along. Surprise, surprise. No one got along with Billy Wilder.
And yet he managed to survive in Hollywood for decades.
He survived in Hollywood. He didn't have the imagination that Wilder, although barely speaking English, had a primitive, brilliant, inherent imagination. And he didn't have the skill of Brackett as a writer, a literary figure. So Brackett didn't have a lot in common with Patros, and they fought, but they didn't battle quite as extensively. Nothing was quite working out. At one point in 1936, in July, Brackett is writing in his diaries, and he said, I waited for an interview with Manny Wolfe, who was one of the studio heads, until 12 o'clock, when he ordered us to report to producer Lloyd Sheldon. He didn't ask him to or invite him to. He ordered us to, which is the way it worked. They were like horses in a stable, as you know. Back at the studio, I was called to Manny Wolfe's office and had dangled before us, this is Frank Patros, not yet Wilder, the possibility of working on the next Lubitsch picture, a 2 weeks trial. And then in August, he writes an entry which is revealing, I went to the studio prepared to give a grouchy refusal to a proposal to shift me from a particular film he wanted to do. They never had any choice in the films they were going to do, as you know, to another story. But I learned the other story is Bluebeard's Eighth Wife with Cleda Colbert, Ernst Lubitsch directing. I am to be teamed, and this is his first reference to Wilder, with Billy Wilder, a young Austrian I've seen around town for about a year or two, and I like him very much. Because of the distance, of course. He didn't yet know him. I accepted the job joyfully. I had a few moments of conversation with Ernst, who had heard about Piccadilly Jim and knows Billy Wilder's work from Germany, probably Robert Siodmak's work, and thinks you might gel as collaborators. Famous last words. We might gel as collaborators. Then in August, still 1936, but prior to really getting to work on Bluebeard's Eighth Wife and still 2 years away from Ninotchka, he's already figuring out who it is that he's fated to work with. He said, I worked with Billy Wilder, who paces constantly, has over-extravagant ideas, but is very stimulating. He has the blasé quality I have missed, sadly, in dear Frank Patros. He has humor, a kind of humor that sparks with mine. And he claimed that it was then time to examine what he was, 32 years old, a slim young fellow with a merry face, particularly the upper half of his face, which is happy. The lower half of his face has other implications. I mean, it was just shocking, the difference between the two.
The two have met and they work on Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, and immediately their creative partnership is fraught, even on that film.
Oh, totally.
There was no honeymoon period. That film, it's interesting how Bluebeard is, I would say, minor late period Lubitsch as far as these things go, which is a high standard. But that film's shortcomings feel more of a piece with Lubitsch's struggles in that period than they do with anything that Brackett or Wilder didn't bring to the table or did bring to the table. But their next film together, Ninotchka, is, I think we both agree, a shining example of the Hollywood studio system and all these artists at their best.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good way to put it. There was no honeymoon period because literally Manny Wolfe, when he put them together, brought one into the office of the other and said, Brackett, this is Wilder. Wilder, this is Brackett. You're a team now. No choice in the matter. Not do you have personality, affinity, nothing. Lubitsch was seduced into making Ninotchka because he really wanted to make the film they made after that, Shop Around the Corner, one of his best films.
The process that Ninotchka took to get to the screen is very interesting in terms of the creative workflow, because this is among Lubitsch's most. It is amazing that the film turned out good because this film was shepherded through so many midwives. Sorry for mixing my metaphors there. Starts out, as a lot of Lubitsch films start out, as a story by a Hungarian author of relatively obscure origin, Melchior Lengyel. But it isn't Lubitsch who originates it as a cinematic project. It's Gottfried Reinhardt who brings it to MGM's attention with the following pitch, which I love. Russian girl, saturated with Bolshevist ideals, goes to fearful, capitalistic, monopolistic Paris. She meets romance and has an uproarious good time. capitalism not so bad after all. George Cukor was the first director attached to the project. William Powell was one of the first actors to be attached to. He and Cukor were going to make the film together.
He would have been good.
Oh, he would have been. I mean, I think the Cukor-Powell version of that film, I would have loved to see that as Universe B. I don't think it would have been as good, maybe, because how many films are this good? Well, that would have been interesting.
But there's a similarity in the energy and spirit between William Powell and Melvyn Douglas. I think, the speed of their repartee. And so it was still going to be Garbro, was it, at that point? But it was still her vehicle, but it was potentially William Powell.
What happens then is that Cukor leaves the project for Gone with the Wind. The studio, MGM, gives Garbo two choices for directors, Golding or Lubitsch. She chooses Lubitsch. And so what does Lubitsch do when he comes on? He brings in Walter Reich because he's not happy with the script and completely rewrites it. Starting with him, he has an exchange, as recounted in the Scott Eyman book, with Reinhardt, where Reinhardt kind of raises hackles about what he's doing with the script. And Lubitsch says, Gottfried, don't make a mistake. Don't fight me on this. You'll lose. Reinhardt apparently took that in stride and later said he was a very nice man, but a very tough man. Wilder and Brackett are called in to do further rewrites, and that's kind of when the Ninotchka we know starts. They completely, along with Walter Reich, so there's actually 3 writers in the room, totally rejigger the script. However, all 3 writers actually fought to get Lubitsch credited as co-writer, unsuccessfully. All 3 of them apparently agreed fully that Lubitsch deserved a co-writer credit, which is strangely generous.
It was, but I think they realized how significant a mentor he was. And I think also, as you've alluded to in your past talks, he did co-write simultaneously with people in the room often, and he acted with actors, acted out the sequence that he wanted them to deal with. So he was very hands-on, and he was friendly but tough, I think is a good way of describing him, because he knew what he wanted. And I think somewhere by now in 1937, Charles Brackett's talking about the writing together, and he says, I worked at the studio. Billy was rather grumpy, and the story was not going well. I got home and was dressing for the opera to which Vivian Lubitsch was taking me, and I got a 5-star telegram, opened it with some agitation to read, I have just learned that you had not had a haircut and a manicure, but also a massage. What does that mean? Charlie, I'm warning you. Ernst. I don't know what that means. He sends him a telegram. He took a day off, apparently, and he didn't go to do something he was supposed to do. Lubitsch found out about it, sends him a telegram, as if it's an urgent Western Union type thing. You had not only a haircut and a manicure, but also a massage. What does that mean? I'm warning you. Don't goof off, I think is what he's saying. But Billy and Ernst were in great distress, March 11th, 1938, writing Ninotchka about the downfall of Austria. Everything falls by the wayside because they're both lamenting the country that doesn't exist anymore. I think it was Ernst Lubitsch who said, the town I came from is still there, but the country is gone. Something like that.
It's interesting how that manifests in the film, I think. The William Powell writes on this thing really eloquently in his book, which I've referenced dozens and dozens of times so far. Because interestingly enough, the opening title card of Ninotchka is a sign of the times, right? The film was released a month after the Nazi invasion of Poland, World War II had begun. And so to make it very clear when the film takes place, they had to add a title card, right? That famous back when a siren was a French woman and not an air raid warning, right?
This world no longer exists or has now vanished.
Exactly. Paul posits that as a sort of a pastness of this. He writes, history necessitated the introductory title, which is a fine turn of events for a film concerned with characters caught up in the inevitable flow of history. I think this film is actually a major turning point for Lubitsch. Capital P politics, the political world, not just characters as a secondhand expression of one political stance or another or political wins, moves to center stage, right? This is a political movie, and most of his films going forward would be expressly political.
Absolutely. I think he kicked open a door in that respect, and he was innovative in many ways stylistically, but I think you're absolutely right. I was surprised when we saw it recently how political it really was. I think when I saw it many times earlier, and even a few years ago, when I curated that program on Alder films, just how political it was. When I first saw it as a kid, it was racy and it was seductive and it was sort of hot and very funny and some slapstick elements. But I guess I didn't really understand the ominous nature of what they were really talking about. And that really came home to me in a big way. It almost hit me in the head when we were watching it in the film festival a couple of weeks ago. That not only was it a beautiful large print, but when they veered off and the story went to Russia to follow her back, that was incredibly bleak and depressing. You're in the midst of a very funny, occasionally screwball kind of comedy, very light, incredible, snappy dialogue, lighthearted, romantic. I mean, everything that a screwball comedy is without being too hysterical. Suddenly, you're following Ninotchka back to this one place where they have 18 people living, whatever it was, and the marching, the May parades. Because up until that point in the film, they're just joking about, I'm impressed about the 5-year plan.
The last mass trials were a great success, right? Fewer but better Russians.
So those things are very snappy and they just went by so quickly. But when they took you back, it was almost like two films. One was enclosed in the other. And it reminded you that all of this is taking place, like the rest of life in everybody's lives, with this dark cloud over their heads.
And the cloud of war, right?
Exactly.
You do get the sense that, whereas in previous Lubitsch films, the kind of sort of Damocles hanging over the central couple, it's always a couple, unless it's designed for living. The sort of Damocles hanging over the central couple is often societal expectations, right? Or money. It's those two things. In this film, it's history itself, right? History itself is getting in the way of their relationship. It's not just Ina Claire's jealousy. Ina Claire is Tsarist Russia. You have Leon caught between a conflict between Tsarist and Bolshevik Russia.
Absolutely.
And also the specter of war on the horizon. The film doesn't shy away from, Nazis show up in the film. In a funny way, that opening title card feels ironic. The opening title card is like, we're able to present you a fairy tale of Europe, circa the mid-30s when things were nice. Immediately, there's Nazis, there's fewer but better Russians.
And I think that may have been almost tongue-in-cheek. It was both an actual historical sort of statement. I think in the end it was tongue-in-cheek. But you're right about the Ina character. She had a similar strategy. It was a communist strategy almost. She's an American, this, I don't want to call her, what would we call her today? A cougar? I guess that's what she was. She had a gigolo anyway.
Another Wilder touch, by the way.
Oh, big time. He was a gigolo in Berlin when he was, living on the streets practically and dancing with wealthy ladies. Yeah, she was an embodiment of that. And the weird thing about the politics of it, considering how serious it was, I look into the diary of the guy who's making the film with Wilder and Lubitsch, learning from Lubitsch, trying to withstand Wilder. He writes at one point in 1939, in January, at the studio all morning, but did exactly one paragraph, as Billy Wilder thought he was having appendicitis and had a doctor come. And the weird thing is, all through the diaries, the work that's going on in great films, whether it's Bluebeard, Ninotchka, or the following films afterwards that they made under their own control after they got out under the thumb of the studios, is the difficulty of having to make a film, like you're saying about war going on, but also in this case, the war between your partner and yourself. He was constantly calling doctors into the office. He was always having nervous breakdowns, Wilder. And at one point in February 1939, one entry in Brackett's private diaries, he says, I quarreled privately with Billy most of the day, I being irritated because he had what I considered a light case of snuffles, and he diagnosed as incipient pneumonia. Worked from 9 until 12 in the afternoon, had a long conference, reading him what we had done. February 11th, I got a message from Ernst Lubitsch asking Billy and me to his house, and went there after taking a brief nap. He there gave us a brief and prejudiced summary of the script, which he felt needed work. He gave us the script, even the one they were working on after fixing it. We came to my place and read it. In the morning, Billy and I finished the Ninotchka script and discussed it. I had to go to Lubitsch's to meet Ernst and Billy, and then on to a story discussion which lasted until 6. Went back to the studio and worked with Billy until 5, a little scared of the fact that Billy's luck was so good. He got his raise and got an option taken up, and he got his job, which Lubitsch had promised him. Went to Ninotchka script meetings on through July. So, the battle is one where you're writing about conflict, the story of Ninotchka, and you're barely surviving every day in the office, which included physical altercations and throwing telephones at each other.
And that's unusual for a Lubitsch office, I'd say. It's interesting. This is one kind of element I love to dig into, is the parallels and also the contrast between Lubitsch's usual process with his writers, because he had his usual friend writers, Hans Crowley, Samson Riffelson being the two most prominent, but there are others. With those, we don't know much about the Crowley collaboration because, one, he never wrote much about it later, but he also fell out with Lubitsch because he ran away with Lubitsch's wife.
Yeah, that'll help.
Not the greatest career move. But what ends up happening is, Samson Riffelson, who writes 9 of Lubitsch's films, has written and given interviews extensively on their collaboration. It is also combative, their collaboration, but it's a controlled explosion of combat, right? They would basically vehemently argue 7 or 8 hours a day, 9 to 5, go to work, argue over the script, and then have dinner together afterwards where you can't talk about the script. And they remained colleagues. Samson Riffelson very touchingly wrote about this later, where he wished they had become better friends. There was a distance, but not any animosity.
Well, I think that was one of Lubitsch's great skills, what you're describing, because the competition was healthy in the earlier stages. But in both Bluebird's Eighth Wife and especially Ninotchka, the two key ones we're thinking of, it wasn't friendly kibitzing. And I think that's why, literally, Lubitsch was smart enough to realize one thing. I've got 2 geniuses. I'm going to leave them alone. He didn't hang out with them. in the offices. He left them to throw telephones at each other. And he knew that was happening because the secretary they shared, Helen Fernandez, would report back to him, how are things going and what's going on. But he left them. And that's a very interesting thing because you leave two people that hate each other because you realize, in his case, he was smart enough to realize that something amazing is coming out of it. And he knew right away once the script was developing, and he knew how he was going to film that script, the snappiness of the screenplay. And a good example of that, I mean, again, in the diaries, he's talking about the last days working on Ninotchka and meeting with Ernst Lubitsch. And again, they worked out of the office quite often. And when they did, it was at Lubitsch's house. And Brackett once described Wilder being jealous of any attention that you've alluded to, that he got more or less. And I think that's one of the insecurities of Wilder. He was a bit of a neurotic individual. This isn't a newsflash to anybody who knows a little bit about his background. He was very defensive, and all through his life, even when he was established after with IAL Diamond, they got along without any combat, actually, because they both had the same background. They were simpatico. They had a Jewish kibitzing mentality. They enjoyed each other's company. But he described Brackett, my last day on Ninotchka, took my type suggestions for changes to Ernst and got some words of praise from him, which was very sweet indeed. And then he went to Metro with Billy and saw some stuff shot for Ninotchka, which is lovely, though Garbo looks less radiant than she should, which is kind of unusual.
She's this famously generational beauty, right? Famously so. Every single piece of writing we read on her waxes poetic about her beauty. They really work against that in the first half of the film, at least. They make her as plain as Greta Garbo can be. But the point being, it's interesting to make that criticism of a film that so telegraphs that it's trying to do that.
Exactly. It's a unique insight because I think they needed that to happen because of the transition or transformation to the glamour of Paris and the hat she wanted, the jewelry she ended up, the clothing she started wearing. She got into what it meant to, at the time, historically or socially, to be a woman, to be a beautiful woman. But they had to make her somehow have a transition. Brackett in his diary, and he describes another good day of work, rare good day, was dictating in Lubitsch's office. And I said, what a swell script we have. And I found I had forgotten Ernst's Shop Around the Corner script, which I was supposed to read. So apparently he was being considered at that point for that. And it would have been very interesting, except I think Lubitsch had had his fill of that bickering. And they had to move on to another director with whom they bickered even more violently, Mitchell Lyson, 3 films for him.
It's interesting how there's 2 major writers on the show. I just recorded an episode on Preston Sturges. Guess what Sturges and Wilder and Brackett all have in common? They hated what Mitchell Lyson did to their movies, which is interesting because I think almost all of Mitchell Lyson's films that he actually directed of those scripts are very good. I quite like Remember the Night. I quite like Midnight.
I love Midnight. And even the ones that are a little stretching of the imagination, Arise My Love, Raymoland, and Hold Back the Dawn.
In Sullivan's Travels, Preston Sturges throws that in as a name drop in a decidedly derogatory way. It's really interesting. I don't know what Lyson did to inspire such disdain.
Lyson was, from all the accounts I've read, a bastard. And he didn't trust writers. He didn't like writers. He didn't respect writers. So the 3 films they made, I'm amazed that Midnight was so good. Of course, Don Amici is a genius. So, I mean, it's a phenomenal screwball comedy, but it's kept somehow tightly contained. It doesn't veer off into completely inane screwball, even though it's an outlandish premise. What he would do would be completely change whole pages of their screenplay license after they've worked really hard on it. And Brackett's diaries are loaded with lamenting. And it actually brought Wilder and him slightly closer together in a way, because they both had to fight Lyson, fight the studios, fight the director. But their experience with those 3 films convinced them that that's the last time we're going to write for another person, for a producer and another director. And indeed, the very next one they make is an independent work, The Major and the Minor, 1942, after Howard Hawks, who worked beautifully with both men because Howard Hawks loved screenwriters.
That resulted in Ball of Fire, which is one of the greatest
phenomenal
romantic comedies there is.
Phenomenal romantic comedy, beautiful script.
Best version of Snow White.
Exactly. But it's because of Howard Hawks' respect for writers and letting them have their space and dealing with it creatively with them, but not literally changing. Lyson would just say to actors, just say whatever you want. Don't pay any attention to what the writers tell you. Now, that's not going to work out really well if you have brilliant screenwriters. Ball of Fire was fantastic, a wonderful break, but still, and that's the one where Howard Hawks allowed Wilder to shadow him on the set and how to set up shots. And he knew he was teaching somebody who was going to be a future competitor. But Howard Hawks had a big heart. He was phenomenally versatile at every kind of film imaginable, had been in Hollywood forever. He didn't mind that a young up-and-coming punk was going to take his place eventually, which he sort of did. But still, the next one after Ball of Fire, Major and the Minor, is the time where they strike out.
Wilder's directorial debut. Was that Brackett's debut as a producer?
Yes. So that's one of the weird phenomenons of their relationship. They hate each other as screenwriters, but they hate producers and directors telling them what to do, changing their work and not respecting them. So they say, okay, we're going to be the co-screenwriters, the producer and the director. So they amplify their original problem. So they think they're solving not working for another producer and director, but what they failed to see, because of how beautifully they ended up with the final product, it's going to be worse because each of them is going to argue with the producer and the director, who is them. But I mean, there are worse problems because also the beauty of how smart I think Wilder in particular was, and Brackett as a producer, and the major and the minor, 43, the first venture they're going to make, Wilder isn't going to start making the bleak films that eventually he made. Even the comedies that he later made are a little bit bleak. He made a really goofy screwball comedy with Ray Milland and Ginger Rogers. Quite a beautiful debut, but a comedy intentionally. We're going to make a comedy first. We're going to get everybody to love us. And then we're going to follow that up with 5 Grays to Cairo, 1943, which the Erich von Stroheim film, Anne Baxter, and it's a wartime film. It's kind of a noir film in the desert, essentially. And that is Wilder unleashing certain aspects of himself, which are going to come further into play with Double Indemnity the year after that in 44. And that, your listeners probably know, is the film where Brackett stepped out of the picture temporarily. It wasn't because he hated working with Wilder, which he did.
Because the subject matter was too,
it was the subject
too
matter.
Dark.
It was it was dark. It was also sordid. It was grimy. The people were cruel. There was no redemption, essentially. He needed redemption. He was a Republican guy who needed people to resolve their conflicts and in the end sort of not be utterly, completely evil. And there was no such resolution. The novel and the story it's based on, he was working on it and writing, but he realized this is going to be absolutely more bleakness that I can take. So he stepped away and he made a ghost film with Ray Milland, The Uninvited. And he basically just took a vacation. People who knew behind the scenes how much they hated each other, that's the end of their relationship. But Wilder brings in Raymond Chandler, who when he was standing up was a very good screenwriter.
That was an even more fraught collaboration, wasn't it? They did not like each other at all.
It was very bad because Wilder couldn't relate to the drunkenness. And however, it was weird because some of that drunkenness may have brought Wilder to the novel that the next film would be based on when Brackett did come back Lost Weekend, 45, which is the most triumphant return of a creative partnership to form that I think I've ever seen because everybody thought, well, that's it. But Double Indemnity, of course, is a masterpiece. It's a noir classic, and it's beautifully written, even though they had fights for different reasons. It was mostly because Chandler was plastered. But the Charles Jackson novel subsequent to that in 44 that Wilder discovered, Lost Weekend, he somehow enticed Charles Brackett to come back and do Lost Weekend together. Brackett had an alcoholic wife, and there was something about the writing, the way they adapted, even though his wife was what they call a beard, a showpiece wife, but there was something about that film which allowed them to go into the darkest recesses of addiction. And I don't think there's a better film, really, even Days of Wine and Roses, which is a masterpiece about alcoholism and addiction and codependence. That's the one which wins Best Picture, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Director. It keeps them going, I guess, as partners. And people who know the remaining films they made together, Foreign Affair in 48.
Which is a film I'd love to go into a bit too.
It's a remarkable film because it's something in it that shows some of what Wilder was able to bring into, first of all, shot in Berlin after the war. So it was in the rubble, shot on location. So it was real. Marlene Dietrich and John Lund.
And it's an actual Trummer film, a subgenre that appeared in Berlin and others. I mean, you could also call The Third Man a Trummer film, if you want to stretch it a little bit. It's a subgenre that appeared due to, we have all these ruined cities in Berlin and immense hurt national trauma and moral morass. So what better place to make, films?
And funnily enough, although not funny in the normal sense of the word, Wilder was even in Berlin and he was seeing the rubble only because at the end of the war, the United States government contacted him and requested his help in making a documentary film about the camps. So he was very nervous about doing it. And Brackett convinced him he should do it because he's German, he's an expatriate, but he can understand the nature of what was done, what happened, because he lost his grandmother and I think his sister, his mother, who he wasn't able to bring out of Germany before they perished in the camps. I'm convinced he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, what today we would call that. Back then, they didn't know what it was, but there used to be something called shell shock. And that was essentially post-traumatic. That was the First World War. But this is post-traumatic because he went over there, he agreed to do it. He made a little film called Death Mills.
That sounds interesting. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on that film because
Oh,
the same set of footage was made into, I mean, you also have the Hitchcock film, the concentration camp factual survey, a couple others too, intended for different audiences. So I
Right.
think Death Mills was the one directed at German
right.
audiences.
But when you admit what you've done, the rest of you, the complicit ones and so forth. So Wilder, I think he experienced something profound and weird and traumatic and convulsive when he was there, though. But weirdly enough, what do you do if you're Billy Wilder? He's a genius of storyteller in cinema. By that point, he can almost speak English very well. Even when he was accepting that American Film Award thing, he admitted that I'm still not very good at speaking English. He even acknowledged Charles Brackett teaching him how to speak English when he got that award. If you're Billy Wilder, you decide to go back after making Death Mills, going back to Hollywood, then goes back to Germany and makes Foreign Affair, which is sort of a weird comedy.
For a film that I think is heavily flawed, it's one of those beautiful films that comes out of such a specific set of circumstances that is fundamentally interesting. I'm going to quote you quoting Wilder in your book because I think this is a good expression of Wilder's immensely bizarre outlook on the subject. He spoke of his grandmother who had been murdered by the Nazis. I know the decent ones. I know the indecent ones. I know the ones who stood outraged. But within them all, there was little jubilation. One Jew less. I could have maybe have saved my mother, but I didn't dare because then there would have been one more. You characterize that as one of the weirdest comments ever made by a generation of the victims of the Nazis.
So really strange. I mean, it was his typical sardonic, dark, sarcastic remark. Things slipped out of him. And I think when he did accept either an Academy Award or that American Film Institute recognition or a lifetime achievement, any of the many awards, he actually remarked up there accepting the award that how I came to America, what brought me to Hollywood. Basically, I came to America so I didn't end up in an oven. I mean, it's true, but for somebody to put it that way so bluntly, he was very attached to truth and bluntness, to his detriment often, because he often told the truth and it got him into trouble. I mean, Foreign Affair, a very strange film. I like it. A lot of people find it hard to relate to. I think it's the odd mixture of exactly what we're talking about, the semi-documentary where there's tons of footage of rubble. There's a documentary in the sense of trauma, the ex-Nazi or the person, the woman who may have been a lover of a Nazi. And then there's pseudo-dark comedy aspects to it. John Lund is a kind of a weird actor, but I think it's a very important film. I think it's a transition film to their masterpiece together 2 years later. But that's the film that broke the camel's back.
As you put it, simultaneously their masterpiece and the film that ended it. There's no turning back from this one.
No, you can't go back. You can't reinvent anything. You get an Academy Award. They both accept it. One is the writer, one is the producer, but they enter the stage from one direction and the other, and they leave it without ever really relating to each other. They go left and right and just forget it. Goodbye. But an amazing history that film has too. I mean, who was approached before Gloria Swanson is in itself an amazing story. Norma Shearer.
I feel like every actress of the silent generation was at one point or another, a lot of this might be apocryphal, approached.
Well, I think it was accurate from what I understand Brackett's diaries to say that Norma Shearer, Paula Negri, Mae West was the first one.
Garbo?
She couldn't. She had retired. I'm too old. I can't do this. Well, all of the people they approached were, I wouldn't say has-beens, but they were legends who were no longer stars and they were reclusive. Mary Pickford was approached. She felt it was too actually close to her real character. Mae West was approached first. That's when Wilder and Brackett, believe it or not, folks, thought it was going to be a comedy, a black comedy, but it was going to open with all these corpses in a morgue with toe tags, and they all get up and start talking about what killed them, how they were murdered or not, and what are they doing. They were the producer and the director, but the studio heads just completely freaked out at the description of and the footage they shot. That was actually shot. And it was then supposed to go into the voiceover of William Holden, but he was supposed to start from actually being a corpse in a morgue. And the comedy part would have been Mae West with her original proposed co-star. Cary Grant, at one point, was approached. Marlon Brando was going to be, that's completely insane to me. Montgomery Clift was one of the people approached to be in Sunset Boulevard. Mae West thought it was offensive to her. You're making me, no, I'm not going to do this. Paula Negri, Norma Shearer, Mary Pickford. Eventually you get to Gloria Swanson. This is what I call Beshert, what Lubitsch would call the Yiddish destiny, the idea that the right person comes along. And you've alluded to it several times. Things get rewritten tons of times before you end up getting to what was supposed to be in the first place, something absolutely a glistening work of perfection. Same is true of who was even going to be in that. But of course, subsequent to this, my book sort of talks a little bit about their solo careers, but Billy Wilder becomes the Billy Wilder that more people know, of course, after this. But he goes into a solo producer, writer, director I'm in control of everything, don't tell me anything mode. But I think he makes one of his first real masterpieces, which I think is still his best film, Ace in the Hole, which many people have trouble with. It's so bleak, it's hard to take.
Oh, yeah. In many ways, I mean, this is I'm really trotting out an old war horse of a simile here, but it does feel like it was made yesterday, thematically.
Literally, or tomorrow, because it's literally about the media world of today, the sensational world, the social media world, the internet world, what's really real and what's not, and how we can exploit people's suffering and make it last longer. I think it's a masterpiece. It's absolutely amazing.
So insightful as to the mechanics of why people choose to exploit suffering instead of fixing it. Because you have a central character who realizes it's unspoken, but he has more to gain from the situation becoming dire than it is. He could have easily fixed it at any given point.
Totally.
But he doesn't.
And as importantly as that, parallel to it is the audience wanting to watch more suffering, which is what today's world is about. The difficulty of the addiction of watching people, which started, I think, with reality television, but now it's gone kind of overboard.
Before we go into Wilder's solo career, though, there's one bit on Sunset Boulevard I think we haven't touched on that I'm really curious about your thoughts on. What happened? Why did Brackett and Wilder split up? I mean, why didn't they split up on Foreign Affair, which I've been reliably told was an arduous process, but why did they split up on one of their greatest films?
His private diaries talk about this. Brackett read about their splitting up in The Hollywood Reporter. Wilder announced it in the press that I'm now independent. I'm not working with Brackett anymore. He literally found out and he was heartbroken. It's not like the guy goes to you and says, well, we both don't get along. Wilder described it that you have to have friction, but sometimes the matches don't strike anymore and they don't ignite. He was already working on, believe it or not, Ace in the Hole while they were making Sunset Boulevard. So he knew he was going to go independent. And then he didn't have a conference with him and say, oh, we've had a great run, 13 films. You probably want to make films on your own too. We have different tastes, whatever, all of which was true. But he literally hammers the guy by announcing it in the press. And Brackett read about it and said, oh, I guess we're not partners anymore. But then Brackett he's the head of the Motion Pictures Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's got a huge career of his own. So his first films independently, he's strictly producing, but writing sometimes, co-writing, but mostly producing. 53 is the first time he makes two films separately after Sunset Boulevard. And he makes two amazing films in 53. Niagara with Marilyn Monroe and Joseph Cotten.
Greatest triumphs of Technicolor cinematography ever.
Well, the greatest noir color film, amazing. And people often don't notice it being noir because the color is so amazing, but Hathaway's direction is pretty splendid. I have a black and white version of it, which a friend gave me. And when you watch it in black and white, you say, oh, this is classic noir. And it is still classic noir as color, but 53, Niagara, amazing. What I like about it is Brackett gets to Marilyn Monroe before Wilder does, because it's not for 3 or 4 more years before Wilder makes the films that he's famous for using Marilyn's prodigious skills in. And I think that's one of Marilyn's best films, Niagara. But the same year, I don't know how, but he produces Titanic, which he wins an Academy Award for as producer, Best Picture, with Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb, which is an amazing film. And it has a real boat in it, folks, an actual boat, not that computer-generated Cameron kind of boat, but a real boat. Then, of course, they go off and Wilder becomes the classic Wilder we know. Brackett makes The King and I, weirdly, after writing and co-producing and directing something like Sunset Boulevard, or even the noir films, Niagara and Titanic, which is sort of an ocean-going noir film. And after that, he starts making very odd films, Journey to the Center of the Earth, phenomenally odd films. But he's just at that point coasting. He doesn't need to. And then he dies quite young, actually. So he's just relaxing. But at that point, Wilder is just revving up to start making some of his most amazing films. But I think at that point, our story draws to a close. And our story really, I think, has been, most enjoyably focused on Ninotchka in the first place, which brings us back to what brought us together.
I have one more question about the trajectories of Wilder and Brackett that I'm very curious about, because you kind of touched upon it, but because Wilder, of course, went on to, 4 more decades of making films, whereas Brackett, obviously, he died younger, but he had long since, before dying, his career had kind of phased out. The story of Brackett is by far the more common one. Like, you hear way more Hollywood types who, kind of have their peak, and then their has-beens at the age of 50. Wilder never was a has-been. I mean, he kind of transitioned from being a director to essentially being a figurehead.
He hits his stride later on, especially with Diamond, afterwards, his great screenwriting partner.
He's perennial on the interview circuit in his 80s, right?
Oh, he never stopped. He loved to talk, and by then he could speak English very well, more or less. He started recycling some of the original legend of his early phase and sort of downplayed a little bit Brackett's role, which is why the book's sort of important. if I can say that immodestly. It restores some of the importance in those first 13 films up to Sunset Boulevard. But there's no doubt that his genius then sort of takes off and he hits his stride. And he's like, a Chariots of Fire type guy. The last lap is happening. He suddenly starts making like 6 or 7 masterpieces. Towards the end, I think he does sort of what happened to Brackett too a little bit. And I think maybe he should have stopped before Fedora and before certain films, but that's another story.
But it's a personality thing for Wilder, right? He never stopped. Brackett he was content to stop, whereas Wilder had a single fixation in his life.
Completely. He had to justify his existence, which he did very well. He continued being a legend. He liked being a legend. Brackett just started writing his memoirs, which are going to come out eventually. He worked on his diary. He was happy, and he was writing another novel. Essentially, he returned to his literary life, which is not one that goes out and continues blabbing, unless you might go on what he may have done was go on Johnny Carson or the Joey Bishop Show, since it's the 60s. He died in 69. You'd expect him sort of to do what Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal did, to go and talk about things. That wasn't his thing anyway. The only thing he talked to was his diaries. Wilder talked to anybody.
And lied to everyone.
Yeah.
He made up
whatever he wanted.
Every single book that goes into Wilder, including yours, it has so many asterisks of like possibly apocryphal. Wilder made up half the things he said.
I give geniuses a huge leeway to be unique, to have primitive skills that only they can do. So it's like saying, well, I want you to continue making all these symphonies and, sonatas, Mozart, but could you not be so weird? No, I'm Mozart. I'm Wilder. That's his story.
Next week, Kevin Bahr joins us to discuss The Shop Around the Corner. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Griffin Sheel was our dialogue editor for this episode. Anna Shatek-Scott was our recording engineer. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.